It's my nerd world, and welcome to it. I am your host, Jon Justice, and this is Depeche Mode, the podcast. This week, have some pretty cool news, and this is something that I have been waiting to hear about, the release of Spirits in the Forest concert film, DVD, and Blu-ray. That's very, very important. We're going to talk about that. Was reading some really interesting comments in the message board on depeche-mode.com. Want to share some thoughts on that. That's going to dovetail nicely into the revisit this week as we move through all the Depeche Mode albums in chronological order. We're going to talk about Sounds of the Universe, which is arguably my favorite Depeche Mode album of the most recent era of Depeche Mode. And that conversation that I was reading on that message board, again, was going to flow really nicely into my thoughts about Sounds of the Universe. So let's not waste any more time, and thank you so much for checking out My Nerd World and Depeche Mode, the podcast this week.
My Nerd World.
It is My Nerd World and a Depeche Mode podcast, and I am your host, Jon Justice, a lifelong Depeche Mode fan, having first heard Depeche Mode back in 1985, listening to Shake the Disease with wide eyes and emotions filled on K-Rock Radio in Los Angeles, California, and I've been a diehard fan ever since. Thank you so much for checking out the show. You can always email me, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, or if you're listening to this on YouTube, you can go and leave a comment on YouTube. If it's the first time you're listening, I would encourage you to go back and listen to the previous episodes, especially the first few, because I really get into my personal background when it comes to Depeche Mode in those first few shows. And I'm trying to be as consistent now with the show as I possibly can. It's been a lot of fun lately because I've actually gone and done something that I hadn't done before, and I don't really know why. I guess I hadn't really thought about it, but I've joined several message boards on Facebook, and I don't spend a lot of time on Facebook anymore. You can find me there, Jon, Jon Justice. You can also find me on Twitter @Jon, @Jon Justice, or on the My Nerd World channel, where I basically on the My Nerd World Twitter, I focus strictly on the science fiction novels that I write and the podcast that I do and pop culture stuff. @Jon Justice is my personal account, so I use that for my personal stuff, and then the full-time radio show that I do here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Monday through Friday. I'm a full-time talk show host. But I don't spend a lot of time on Facebook anymore, and recently, and I think it's because what happened was the news broke that Depeche Mode was going to be releasing the Spirits in the Forest concert film and DVD, and I ended up sharing it. You know, the algorithms on Facebook. I had some of the message boards or the pages for Depeche Mode pop up, and I decided, you know what, I'll go and join them. And it was fun too, because if you've joined any of these Facebook Depeche Mode pages, but not all like this, but a couple of them that I joined, they have a little questionnaire, to make sure you're not a robot or a bot or a Russian agent. And they ask you, questions. It's almost like you got to prove your Depeche Mode acumen. So that's fun, And then, so as a diehard fan, they ask questions like, name 3 B-sides. I rattled off like 10. How many times have you seen Depeche Mode live? 34. It was just, so that was cool. But it's been fun because I'm getting now a bunch of Depeche Mode stuff in my feed, and that's actually putting me on Facebook more so than I had in the past. And again, it's just fun to be around other Depeche Mode fans. And as I've mentioned in a couple of shows back, because I'm also a huge Star Wars fan. The 3 things, and when you work past the list of the things that are most important in my life, when you go sort of God, my family, and my job, and then we get into the 3 loves that fill me with joy beyond those things, and it's NASCAR, Star Wars, and Depeche Mode. But the thing that's truly special about Depeche Mode is that the fandom is just so kind to each other. And even with going into some of the message boards, and I'll talk about this, even going into some of the message boards where there is every single opportunity for fans to go at each other for a difference of opinion based off of, certain releases. The fans don't. And I've been sort of a lurker and an infrequent commenter on the Halo boards, and that's at Depeche-mode.com. And I recognize so many of the names on there, but there's just such a level of respect within the Depeche Mode fandom that just isn't found within pop culture fandom right now. And maybe it's more exclusive to music, but Depeche Mode is really the only band that I follow enough beyond just listening to the music or perhaps seeing them in concert. Right, Depeche Mode is a way of life, and there is a mythology behind Depeche Mode. For those of us that have been following the band for any length of time, I think that most Depeche Mode hardcore fans, regardless of how old you are or when you were introduced to the band, you get into this band, again, beyond the music. It's more than just the songs that they put out. It's the images that they put out. It's the videos that they put out. It's the releases that they put out. And then it's the concerts that we go to. And, while I believe in the Lord God Almighty, one could use a Depeche Mode show, and an analogy of it's kind of like going to church. I'm not worshiping the band, but when it comes to the mythology, the gathering of Depeche Mode fans at a concert is a different experience than going and seeing most other bands. Again, I'm sure that some bands also have followings like Depeche Mode, but I also think that that's largely reserved for bands that are holdovers from the 80s and 90s. I think it's much harder now for artists to achieve that level of fandom because pop culture and entertainment in and of itself is so diluted right now because there's so much available. Back when Depeche Mode was coming up and you didn't have all these other distractions, as well as I do, if you've been following Depeche Mode, almost as long as I have. I'm 47 years old, been following since 85. That, in those years in the 80s and 90s, you didn't have all those ancillary things, man. It was all about this band and every little thing you can get your hands on. I would go, especially during the Violator and specifically the Songs of Faith and Devotion era, when the albums were in their pre-promotion hype. I mean, I would search out every single bit of literature, magazine article, newspaper article, NME, which I have an article here in front of me. And I would buy all of it just so I could get every little nugget of information because we didn't have the internet back then at that point in time. It was right around the corner, but that's how you got all your Depeche Mode background. And there was a lot of stuff written back then. I have a whole box in my garage filled with pretty much every single article or reference to Depeche Mode between like 91 and say like 97. Certainly the Songs of Faith and Devotion era. That era was, for me, like the biggest Depeche Mode era when I was the most involved and into the band, and I gobbled up every little bit of information I could, and every cover that had the long-haired, tattooed, goatee Dave Gahan on it. All right, so I'm getting a little ahead of myself because we are going to talk a bit about the fandom, but I do want to talk about the big news this week, which I'm really, really excited to share with you if you haven't seen it already.
My Nerd World.
So, the big news this week. Depeche Mode to release Spirits in the Forest concert film and DVD. I talked about this before. I wasn't, and I'm not the biggest fan of the documentary Spirits in the Forest. It's interesting. I'll probably have to revisit it. I think maybe my expectations were too high on an initial visit, and I'll certainly be doing this with this physical release. But this is what I was really, really hoping for. I bought the digital release for Spirits in the Forest, but I think for me and a lot of fans, we really want that entire concert, in physical form, and we're going to get it now. Depeche Mode have announced, according to the NME, that they will release their acclaimed Spirits in the Forest documentary concert film on DVD for the first time next month. Arriving on March 27th, the film captures the rockers in full flight as they played the final two shows of their global Spirit tour in Berlin in 2018. And I didn't even pick up on the fact that these were the final two shows of that tour, so that's pretty cool. The film, directed by Anton Corbijn, has never been released in its entirety, but will be showcased across a special 4-disc package, as well as capturing the shows on 2 video discs, as the enemy puts it. 2 CDs also contain the Live Spirits soundtrack, so it's essentially what they did with 101. We're going to get a CD versions of the live versions of the concert itself, and live audio recording of their first 2 performances. The official release teases a revisioning of the very concept of a music documentary. Director and longtime Depeche Mode collaborator Anton Corbijn focused on the narrative of 6 superfans from different regions around the globe. Speaking to the NME about the movie, Anton Corbijn said, "It's just a different take on a live film, really. I don't really like live films, but I need to with Depeche Mode because I design everything, so I want there to be a document of it. They were only interested if there was a different angle to it, so we decided to look at the reason for why Depeche Mode was still growing. They have all these fans, and they're the biggest cult band in the world. It's unbelievable." And look, I have a tremendous amount of respect for the band and their desire to do things differently. And their pushing of the envelope of, we just don't want to do blank. I really, really do respect that. And I'm glad they do that. At the same time, I do think there also is a level of, we've done things before that have worked really well. I'm of the opinion that there's no reason the band can't return to doing updated versions of things they've done in the past when it comes to, say, video releases, right? And we've talked about this before, the desire to have the World Violation tour out in some kind of physical release at some point in time. They obviously wanted a different documentary. They didn't just want to put out a physical concert like they have, and Depeche Mode's been pretty consistent as of late of putting out physical releases of their stuff. And they always kind of do something different. The fan angle of it is really interesting to me. And I liked the fans in the documentary. I just like the way that it was handled in 101 more. And to a lesser extent, despite the bad quality of just having a DVD release for, Live in Berlin and Alive in Berlin, I do like what Anton Corbijn did with those fans and talking to those fans outside of those shows as well. I am really happy that we're getting an actual Blu-ray release on this. I've mentioned this many times, but one of the biggest complaints that I have is that the concert footage for the Berlin show, for the Live in Berlin and the Live in Berlin release, is the footage itself is fantastic, right? The concert's great. But, Anton's choice to do it on DVD, but having it not be, as I mentioned last week, a physical transfer from film, ends up creating this bizarro DVD pixelated sort of line through the screen breakup, and it just looks so awful. I know there's a digital release, but I like having those physical releases. So I was stoked, knowing what we saw in the Spirits in the Forest movie, that we were going to be getting a full release of that particular live show. So that has me really, really excited. And it's interesting too, because in the middle of all this, and the record label with the U.S. record label of Columbia, and what they've been doing with their Instagram and with their Twitter and with their Facebook account. If you're new to the show, I was really blessed and privileged to be highlighted on the Twitter and Instagram pages for Depeche Mode with a quick 1-minute video explaining what the band means to me. And it's cool because the official page out of Paraguay recently reposted my video. And it's really special to me because if you go to the Instagram, like, I'm there with the individuals from the Spirits in the Forest documentary. So it's pretty cool. I'm really sort of honored to still be up there. My big old goofy fat face. I filmed it at 5 o'clock in the morning at the radio station I work at. So it's really cool to see that. But ultimately, my point is, without doing, pinkies up, I'm not trying to brag or anything. But what I'm trying to drive at is the record label seems to be doing a really good job of promoting Depeche Mode. And that's cool to see. For those of us that have been following the band, you know that when it comes to record labels, it's been rough. Sometimes the band, depending on who's representing them, doesn't do a very good job of promoting the band. There certainly have been various record labels throughout the years here in the U.S., but it really seems like Columbia is doing a really good job and understands the importance of this band. It probably revolves around the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, right? The induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I'm sure. But it still is really encouraging to see that there is a level of promotion around Depeche Mode and keeping that energy and hype up. The push for the box set, I thought was really good. The fact that even in between releases, they're reaching out to fans and putting out content from fans, even if the band's not putting anything new out beyond this physical release coming out. And ultimately, I hope that it's encouraging to the band itself, so we end up getting some new music from them sometime in the near future. I think everybody at this point is pretty convinced that the band's going to end up in the studio at some point and record some new material. But in the meantime, we can look forward to this physical release on Blu-ray and DVD of Spirits in the Forest, the documentary, the CDs, and the complete final two shows of the actually, I think it's one show, but they're using both nights of the final show in Berlin of the Global Spirit Tour on the disc. So really excited about this. Was hoping it was going to happen, and glad to see that it finally is happening. And it was the news of the release, or the announcement of the release of this Spirits in the Forest, that brought me over, a few days back to the message boards, the Halo message boards. Again, Depeche Mode, Depeche-mode.com. And like I said, a place that I've been, infrequently posting, but lurking quite a bit, because I love to go in there when there's news breaking and just kind of see what the fans are saying. And I actually ended up on the main thread for Spirit. I don't even know how many pages it is now, but that thread's been there on that message board since the release of the album. And there was a really interesting conversation going on about Spirit, looking back on the album, and we'll be getting to that as we continue to move through chronologically through the albums, and I'll be talking about Sounds of the Universe here in just a moment. But like so many of the Depeche Mode releases, our opinions change over time. I know for me, there is sort of the initial excitement of having a brand new Depeche Mode record and listening to it and consuming it and everything around it, the lyrics, the packaging, the touring, right? So you're really excited and you get into it, and I'm one of those fans where I always like the latest thing at that moment the most. And then, like it normally works out with any type of entertainment, you spend enough time with something and then you end up changing your perspective on it. And there was a lot of people on the message board that were expressing a bit of their disappointment in retrospect over Spirit. But again, it was so respectful, and everybody is so keen to just say, hey, we agree to disagree. But this conversation on the message board broke out over the style of Depeche Mode and the way that they have been, the sound of the band post Songs of Faith and Devotion. And I think the jump-off point for the conversation was somebody had mentioned that Songs of Faith and Devotion was not a rock album, right? And there was some back and forth of people sort of defining what a rock album means and what's an electronic album. I remember when Songs of Faith and Devotion was released, the first image and information that we got about the album came from Q Magazine. And I'll never forget going to this import store, which I'm sure doesn't exist anymore, called Hyde Park Corner in Irvine, California, and walking in, and the magazine, the Q Magazine, sitting there in front of me with a black and white photo that Anton Corbijn had shot of Dave Gahan in that patented sort of Songs of Faith and Devotion vest with no shirt underneath, and you could see all of his tats, and his hair had gone long. He had the goatee on, and the headline was something to the effect of "Rock and Roll Tattoos ERR Depeche Mode ?" And I'll never forget getting into a conversation with the employee there as I was purchasing the magazine and expressing how I was hoping that there would be more songs on Songs of Faith and Devotion than there was on Violator. It was a weird critique that I had at the time of Violator. I loved the album so much, but I was disappointed there was only 9 songs on the album. And I think he had mentioned something of, well, you'll be pleased to know that there's more than 9 songs on this, according to the article. I'll never forget that. But then the conversation on the message board sort of turned to the influences of Depeche Mode and their desire to do this electronic blues type of music. And there was a lot of people, and I kind of agree, that were stating how they'd wished that the band would perhaps drop a bit of the blues angle. And I agree, that really started to permeate in Violator, but it was still very electronic based and melody based. It didn't quite have the crunchiness or the full blues that we end up getting into these albums that we're covering right now. And I tend to agree. I would love to see the band, going back to what I talked about a moment ago, of how the band keeps wanting to push the boundaries. I hope that perhaps the band is at a point now where they can go, you know what, we've been doing this blues rock hybrid now for a few albums. You know, what about if we strip it back down and go to something that's a little bit more upfront electronic based? Because it'd be wrong to say it's not electronic based. Of course it is. But that rock blues edge there, I'm fine with them moving off from that. And I hadn't really talked about that much in looking back at these albums. I guess I kind of touched upon it, but not into the depth that these individuals were on that message board. And I thought it was a really, really interesting conversation. And several of the guys were breaking down, like Playing the Angel, which we covered last week, and making comparisons to Songs of Faith and Devotion and going back to Ultra. Okay, so where is all this leading, and what am I talking about? Well, it's leading to revisiting Sounds of the Universe. This album, I've realized in the process of doing this show, this album is the most meaningful to me and probably my favorite release from Depeche Mode since Songs of Faith and Devotion. There are individual songs on previous albums, your Ultra, your Exciter, your Playing the Angel, that I love, don't get me wrong. But when it comes to, and a lot of it comes from a personal level. If you asked me, you know, John, if you could hang on to one album post Songs of Faith and Devotion, which would it be? It would probably be Sounds of the Universe. And it would be Sounds of the Universe, and I'll get to the personal angle here in a moment, but mostly because this album, to me, is the one that sounds the most electronic, but still is different enough from the Black Celebration, Music for the Masses, Violator, Songs of Faith and Devotion era. I really like some of the tinkering and the instrumentation and the depth of this record. If you've watched the documentaries, they are very quick to point out in the documentaries how Martin Gore was buying all of this old school recording equipment and instruments and samplers, and he had just this whole room just filled along with guitars, but he had all these samplers. And so basically Ben Hillier, the band, the production assistants were all tinkering with these machines that Martin was buying, and through that they ended up using a bunch of it on this record. Now, there's still some crunchiness to the album. You know, you get into a song like Comeback, and, you know, sort of that wailing guitar and that wall of sound. I was put off by that for a while. Now I absolutely love it. So before I kind of go through and do my track by track and give my thoughts, the album is also really, really important to me because back in 2009, I suffered a heart attack. I had a bicuspid valve. I had 2 flaps instead of 3. I didn't know. And when you have 2 flaps in a heart valve, it doesn't function correctly, and the blood will eventually start backing up. And you run the risk of getting blood clots. And if those blood clots move out of the valve, they can go and clog an artery. And that's what happened to me. I also had an ascending aortic aneurysm. So because the valve wasn't functioning properly, my aorta had been enlarged. And because it had been enlarged, I ran the risk of it erupting. So I had to go in and have open heart surgery. When this happened was when the album started to leak online. And then the first single for Wrong and the video or the performance they did on the British television show actually came out during my time in the hospital. So I have I won't say fond memories, but I have memories of being in the hospital going through all of this and listening to bootleg, they were demos. There was a demo of Fragile Tension that got released, which was really close to the album version. There was a demo of Hold to Feed that got released, and there was a demo of Comeback that got released. And it's interesting, too, because the ones that got released that I was listening to while in the hospital were very different from the demos that we ended up getting on the box set, which is arguably the best box set they've put out. I love the Sounds of the Universe box set, and I'm going to save my commentary on that for after we move through the albums. I'm going to start working through some of the other releases the band has done when we talk about the live releases, and we're going to talk about the actual box sets that have been released throughout their career. But I love the Sounds of the Universe box set. But those demos that got released were different. The version that I have of, and again, it's unfortunate I can't play it on the show because I keep getting dinged for copyright issues when I put it up on YouTube. So that's why you're getting my fake Depeche Mode music. That's all me, and not actual Depeche Mode music on the podcast. But the version of Comeback that I had was really, really interesting. The tempo was different. The melody, the lyrics were the same, but the melody was different. And I never found out or read why that was the case or how that happened. And I keep them. They're not nearly as good as the actual releases. So it's not like you're missing anything. They're pretty close to what you got on the demos on the Sounds of the Universe box set, but they were very, very different. So at that point in time, this was another period where Depeche Mode was very comforting to me. Listening to Depeche Mode music is always an incredibly special experience. Listening to leaked Depeche Mode music, right? And I don't have any problem saying that because I purchase all this stuff anyways, is also unique and special and different. And it was a real comfort to me going through this very difficult time at a young age of 32. It was a real comfort to me. No, actually, I'm sorry, I was 37. Real comfort to me being in the hospital during this period of time. The flip side is the album was released shortly after my recovery, and so I was still sort of dealing with the ramifications of having to go through an open heart surgery. I had to do it again in 2012, but I won't get into that now. But it is funny how these Depeche Mode sort of revolves around things that happened in my life, and they were there to sort of get me through it. But when I was still in the recovery phase is when Sounds of the Universe came out. And I really do love this album, and I loved it at the time. And now that I've had all this time to spend with these albums and going back over these, I was again surprised to discover in pulling the album out and revisiting it how much I actually love this album. So let's move through quickly just the tracks on the album, and I'll share some of my thoughts and my criticisms as well. I've actually made some edits of some of these songs because I want to get to the good stuff. The opening track of In Chains, I'll never forget listening to that for the first time. I was visiting my mother-in-law in Tucson, Arizona, and I was pulling out of their block. And I don't know exactly why it was that moment when I finally had the chance to hear it. But for whatever reason, I finally got my hands on the album, whether it was leaked first or this was the physical version. And I remember driving down the specific road at the specific time of day and hearing In Chains and that really long intro. And that's kind of what I mean. If it were me, I would trim down that intro and get right to the song. You go through this really long intro using the theremin, right? Again, Martin Gore and his toys at the time of this recording. And then when you hear Dave Gaughan's voice and the lyrics for the first time on any Depeche Mode song, it's just that you instantly know it as a fan. You just go, it's like a warm, it's just like a breeze of warm air on a cool, sort of fall day. It just hits you in all the right places. I absolutely love In Chains. I felt it was classic Depeche Mode, and was the perfect opener on the tour, even if I didn't really care for the projections all that much. I did not care, and still to this day don't care for Hole to Feed. I would go so far as to say it's probably my least favorite Depeche Mode song of the era post Songs of Faith and Devotion. It's a lyrical thing for me and a lack of relatability thing for me. And it's probably, if I was going to complain about anything when it comes to Dave Gaughan's lyrics, whether it's specifically with this song or some of his solo stuff, his writing is good. I really enjoy it, and some of the stuff he's done is fantastic. But there's a quirkiness, and I'm hesitant to use perversion, but there's a quirkiness about Dave Gaughan that's very uniquely Dave Gaughan, but it gets into the lyrics sometimes, and the Hole to Feed lyrics just didn't ever work with me. Neither did sort of the drum cadence in the background. The video is by far my least favorite Depeche Mode video ever, and I was hoping for a video at that point in time with the band sort of using different, they were using different directors at that point in time when it came to their videos. I was really hoping that they would do something special with this, and maybe I would appreciate the song more, but we got this really weird video with this bizarre band up on stage, and then everybody French kissing, and I'm not a prude by a stretch of the imagination, but I cannot watch that video. Then we get into Wrong. I could spend an entire podcast talking about Wrong. I think Wrong is one of the best Depeche Mode songs they've ever done. Certainly one of the best Depeche Mode songs the band has done during the era post Songs of Faith and Devotion. I actually thought that video was really different, unique, and cool. And again, hearing that song for the first time while recovering in the hospital after my open heart surgery was a really special, unique experience. As a matter of fact, I think my wife actually played it for me down the phone. I think we got it, and I was at the hospital, and she wasn't there at the time, and she actually played the song for me over the phone, if I'm not mistaken. Fragile Tension, the video for that's pretty cool, but I actually really do like that song. It's pretty simple. It's got a bit of a behind-the-wheel-esque feel to it, but I like the electronic nature of Fragile Tension. Then you get into one of the Martin Gore tracks that, again, better than what he'd done, in my opinion, on Playing the Angel. Little Soul does have that Counterfeit 2 vibe, and I don't think I've talked about that. But it's interesting because Martin Gore and his release of Counterfeit 2 and doing those covers really, in my opinion, had an impact on his solo work that he was creating for the albums. For good or bad, it's all subjective. But I thought that Little Soul was a higher point than what we received when it comes to Martin Gore-led tracks. And I really like the instrumentation and the way the music flows in that as well. In Sympathy has arguably become one of my favorite Depeche Mode songs. It's just one of those ones that I love the driving nature of it. I love the lyrics of it. Again, the instrumentation, how they worked Martin Gore's equipment that he purchased. That is a song that I go back to over and over and over again, as is actually this next little trilogy here, In Sympathy, Peace, and Comeback. That's just a really good grouping of songs, and it's one of the few times in that post-Songs of Faith and Devotion era for me that we get just a good sort of grouping of songs on an album. And it's one of the things about the albums that we're discussing right now, again, that post-Songs of Faith and Devotion era, where for me things changed, where previously, like, I loved every track on those albums and they all flowed together really well. I think the absence of Alan Wilder is what ended up creating a bit of this, and again, my opinion, a bit of this disjointed feel when it comes to a lot of Depeche Mode releases that we got after he left. I think Alan Wilder did a really good job of crafting the songs and placing them on the album in such a way and picking the songs that were going to be used where it made for a better cohesive album, whereas the releases after that, the band was still picking and choosing which songs to use, but I think that another voice during the production could have helped to maybe switched up some of those tracks. Like, I think that there's certain songs like The Sun and the Moon and the Stars that would have been better to put on the album than, say, Hold to Feed, or even Ghost, I think would have been, or Light. All three of those tracks. I personally would have replaced Hold to Feed with one of those. Even Miles Away, The Truth Is, to be honest with you. Spacewalker, again, instrumental, but it's cool. I dig it. Perfect is perfect. I love that song. I feel like that should have been a bigger hit than it was. But lyrically, so Depeche Mode. Musically, so Depeche Mode. Really, again, another track that I go back to over and over and over again. Miles Away, The Truth Is, for me, I can take it or leave it. I don't turn it off if it's on, but I'm not going and seeking that track out. Jezebel is another one that I really, really like from Martin Gore. And again, I think that this album represents a high point of Martin Gore tracks in this particular era. And then you get to the closer of the album in Corrupt. And again, Corrupt is quintessential Depeche Mode for me. I wish that they would do that song live. I thought the vibe of that song, the lyrical content of that song, and sort of this sinister nature of Corrupt worked really, really well. Better than it had on previous attempts. So I look at Corrupt and I kind of put it in a category of sort of the more angsty of the 2000 era Depeche Mode songs. I love A Pain That I'm Used To, but I put it kind of in that category. Barrel of a Gun, love that song as well. I think Dead of Night was trying to be that on Exciter, but didn't really hit the mark. But to me, Corrupt fits into that Barrel of a Gun. Even I Feel You, A Pain That I'm Used To, and that sort of angsty, a little bit of perversion. I'm using that word again, but I don't know what other word to use. Element that Depeche Mode does so well. There's a sinister nature about it, but it still has this warmth to it. And that may sound twisted and weird, but it does. Corrupt is one for me that I love singing in the car. Let's put it that way. Which may seem weird and bizarre, but I do. I really, really love that song. And I'm looking at actually I have the Sounds of the Universe CD plus DVD in here. So with this, before the box set came out, you got the Sounds of the Universe short film, you got the Wrong video, and then they had a couple of remixes in here of In Chains, Little Soul, and Jezebel. Sounds of the Universe also represents some of the best documentaries that we've got. And again, we'll cover this on the box set with the box set conversation that we have coming up in the near future. But Sounds of the Universe, the documentaries for this on that box set are just absolutely amazing. I go back and watch those all the time. I will say that the artwork is probably the only complaint, and the biggest not the only complaint, but I will criticize the artwork a little bit. I don't necessarily care for what Anton was trying to do. It's okay. I prefer a little bit more of either the clean Depeche Mode logos or something more akin to what Anton does with his photographs. And the circle with the lines, with the colored lines and all that, I get what Anton was going for, and it was unique and different, but it's certainly not the favorite. So when it comes to the packaging and the marketing around the album, not a high point, even though the album itself and the musical content absolutely is. I would have loved to have seen, like, Sounds of the Universe have something more akin to what Anton did with Spirit, which I thought was really good. Or even Delta Machine to a certain extent. But that's okay, because when I'm driving in the car, I'm not looking at the album cover. The liner notes are good, and the photographs around it are. I'm listening to the amazing, delicious music. That's what I'm doing. All right, that wraps up the show this week. Thank you so much for checking out My Nerd World, Depeche Mode, the podcast. If you want to support the show, I'm a science fiction author, and I'm writing a series of books called EMBARK, based in the somewhat distant future where car culture has air and space flight culture has replaced car culture. It is a sort of a cross between Ready Player One, Fast and Furious, and Star Wars. But if you're a sci-fi fan, and obviously a Depeche Mode fan, I really think you'll enjoy these books. There are, as I've mentioned before, a ton of references to Depeche Mode in the books, especially in EMBARK Book 1, which is available now, as is EMBARK Book 2, Treasure in Darkness. The main protagonist, Taft, is a massive Depeche Mode fan. And there's all kinds of different Easter eggs relating to Depeche Mode, direct references and indirect references. As a matter of fact, I'm introducing a character in the third book, which will close out the opening trilogy of the story, that fans of Depeche Mode will instantly... I don't want to say relate to, but you'll go, oh, yeah. If you're reading the book and you're a Depeche Mode fan, you didn't know I was a Depeche Mode fan, when this character gets introduced, you're going to go, this guy's a Depeche Mode fan. So if you want to support the show, I don't do Patreon, but I do ask that if you are a sci-fi fan, go and pick up a copy of my science fiction space opera novels. They're called EMBARK. They're written by me, Jon Justice, Jon Justice. You can find them on Amazon in ebook for just $2.99. Paperback for $12.99 and $11.99, and also in audiobook, narrated and produced by me. If you purchase the ebook, you get a massive discount on the audiobook. If you've already purchased the books, thank you very much, and if you enjoyed them, please go to Amazon and leave me a positive review. That would really, really help me out. But if you want to support the show and you've already purchased the books, you can gift them to a friend. So if you know somebody who maybe isn't a Depeche Mode fan, but maybe they're a sci-fi fan, right there on the Amazon page, you can gift them an ebook copy of the book or buy them a paperback. They're really, really fun adventures. They're great for all ages. I've got 70-year-olds who enjoy the book, as well as 12 and 13-year-olds who enjoy the book. And that was kind of my point, to create a fun science fiction space opera adventure that had pop culture references like Ready Player One, had the sort of technology and adventure and the good versus evil storytelling of Star Wars, but in a completely different form. And I really feel like I've accomplished that. More books are on the way, but do me a favor, support the show and go pick up a copy of EMBARK or EMBARK Treasure in Darkness Book 2 ahead of the Book 3, The Vanishing War, which comes out sometime in April. All right. Thank you so much for checking out the show. We'll be back again next week. Leave me an email, right? TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, or a comment on YouTube. And before we close the show out, I have one listener feedback to share with you this week. Chuck said this: John, totally agree with the 4 best albums. Went to the Playing the Angel tour. I'm sorry, I got to back this up. Totally agree with the 4 best albums. I went to the Playing the Angel tour, and Dave was awesome on that tour. The stage was great. Wondering if you've ever seen the documentary called The Posters Came from the Walls. It's about going to see them in Eastern Europe and other huge fans. Once again, love the show. Finally, I feel that I belong. Feels like home. Chuck, I have not seen The Posters Came from the Walls, but I really, really need to. And I'm going to put that on my list of watching for this weekend because I've heard great things about it at the time of its release. I don't know why I didn't see it at the time, but definitely there's an opportunity to catch up on it now. And thank you so much for sharing. All right, that wraps things up for this week. Again, thank you for checking the show out. We'll be back again next week. And go to Amazon.com, search for Jon Justice, and EMBARK, and pick up your copy of my science fiction space opera series. It's the way to support the show, and I really do appreciate it. Thank you ahead of time. We'll talk to you again in a week. Bye.
My Nerd World.